what role can trade play to further enhance some of our goals to get to net zero?
Yeah, well, you said the right word, Francine. We really feel that trade is the missing link, that when countries need to revise their national NDCs, determine contributions and their action plans, they need to put trade and trade policies in there, in the center. Because people are used to seeing trade as part of the problem, and I'm not denying that trade contributes, of course, to carbon emissions. But trade is a central part of the solution. Just think about this. If you have a climate event, trade is an adaptation tool. You can't get goods and services to help your country to rebound that you need without trade. We need to move goods and services. Trade is a mitigation tool. If you need technology to move, again, goods and services, you need trade. But people take trade for granted. And that's what we're trying to say, no, you've got to have trade policies. And so let me just, I'm not, as I say, I always deny selling this, but here it is. We did a World Trade Report. Our flagship report is on trade and climate. And what we've done is to make the analysis, we have some analysis, but also recommendations on what countries should be thinking about when they revise these plans. They must put trade as part of the solution.
Yeah, so everyone has to pick it up. It's concise reading, about 222 pages.
There is an executive summary, Francine.
Dr. Ngozi, when you look at trade, first of all, if you fragment trade, and I don't know whether we're less global, and we will be less global than we used to be, does it make it more difficult to find green solutions for these trades?
Well, you're asking all the right questions.
Almost. It's as if I worked at Bloomberg.
Well, you know, we're very concerned about the talk about decoupling and fragmentation of trade. So let me step back one moment and acknowledge that there are real geopolitical tensions. We live them every day at the WTO, whether it's US, China, China, EU, EU, US, Russia, Ukraine. This is something we live with and have to manage. And we know that the pandemic and the war in Ukraine has shown great vulnerabilities to us of certain supply chains that are concentrated, too concentrated. You know, people did not realize that 80% of the world's vaccines are exported from 10 countries. You know, there are some supply chains we all know that are 90% concentrated in certain countries. So yes, then when this realization has made everyone realize how vulnerable the world is. So there's this tendency to say, we'll reshore, we'll friendshore. And we're being realistic. Some of that will happen. But what we're saying is let that not result in decoupling or fragmentation of trade, because it will be inimical to resolving the climate crisis. It will be inimical to global growth. And WTO economists have actually simulated what would happen if we were to break into two trading blocks, fragment into two trade. The loss of technological spillovers and economies of scale alone would result in a 5% loss in global GDP in the longer term. Just think about it. Size of the economy of Japan, or, you know, just think of the fact that the OECD countries lost 3.5% of their GDP during the Great Recession. And you know what we are talking about. We certainly don't want that to happen. And we certainly don't want emerging markets and developing countries to bear the brunt.
But Dr. Ngozi, when you look at trade, so what are the real solutions that would make a difference? And we've seen high prices, for example, in shipping. Is that a benefit because it means you can implement climate solutions, greener vessels or things like this? Or do we need things to cool down to then step up our efforts in the transition?
So let's tackle this from several points of view. First, let me just continue a little bit with the don't let's fragment. And I say don't let's do that because part of the cost is that we will not be able to solve, as I said, we can't get goods and services where they are needed to help solve the climate. We need strategic cooperation to solve the climate. We need to move those goods and services. We need to move green tech. And you know that we've managed to get the cost of green technology down, solar panels and so on. Trade has been a big part of that. Then you talk about shipping. We hope that the logistics of trade and all that will become green. Everybody is looking at green hydrogen and so on. So that's part of the solution as well on the costs of trade to climate emissions. But going back to the solutions of trade, I'm still insisting with you that part of that solution we have to look at must step away from this idea that we can't all work together. There are certain problems of the global commons that no one country can solve on their own, and that's why we're insisting on this. It would terribly affect trade.
Are countries sharing information on how they measure some of the emissions in trade, on some of the solutions?
Yes, countries are, sharing technology. They're sharing solutions. We want them to do more of that. We also want developing countries. They obviously cannot make this transition without finance as well. Some of the investments that are needed, so if you have the technology, but you can't really invest in it or use it because you don't have the financing, then that's a problem. And a lot of countries are debt distressed now with the inflationary pressures, the high interest rates. So they need the financing to help them make the transition. So yes.
I mean, trade is really at the heart of everything. It's like the pipeline that no one really thinks about.
Yeah.
But you're moving services also to countries that have been devastated by climate weathers.
Absolutely. And that's why we think it's an adaptation tool. So if you cut yourself off and you fragment or you only trade with your neighbors, you'll miss all that innovation, technology, and so on that may occur in some other part of the world.
Are you optimistic that things will get done at COP27?
Well, when I first arrived, I wasn't very optimistic, to be honest. But as the couple of days have gone by, and I've listened to leaders, not just make promises, but some actual pledges. For example, there was the Africa Adaptation meeting that happened, I think it was yesterday. And some concrete pledges were made by the UK, by France, by Norway, additional, incremental to what they had made before. So that gives me the hope that this is an implementation COP and we'll actually see action. There's also been the discussion on loss and damage, which was not being sort of pushed away before. It's now being accepted. The Bridgetown agenda of Prime Minister Mia Mottley that is setting out how to reform the international financial architecture and how to leverage public finance or more private finance for those trillions that we keep talking about. How are they going to get to where they are needed? So some of this talk is going on, and actually there is an openness to it. So I'm a bit more optimistic. Now we have to get trade in there, and then I'll be even more optimistic.
So what are the next steps to get trade in there?
I think the next steps is twofold. We've tried to spell out specific recommendations. For example, I'll just give you one. If we can work on an environmental goods and services agreement, that will lower the cost of these environmental goods and services so that countries that want to adopt them will find it cheaper to do. That would be a good thing. There was an environmental goods and services agreement being negotiated, but it was shelved in 2016. So practical recommendation, can we try to look at this and revive it, even with a smaller quantity of goods? One of the tools for taking care of decarbonization is carbon pricing. We are also saying that we need a global carbon pricing framework for the world to follow. There are 70 fragmented pricing systems or taxing systems now. Imagine for business, how do you cope with this? Many developing countries also see this maybe as a protectionist measure. But if we develop a global framework that everyone can follow, then that will make it easier. That's another recommendation. And we're actually working on it with the IMF, the OECD, and the World Bank.
So when do you know whether this is for real? These at the moment are recommendations.
Yeah.
And I also quickly want to get a show of hands of who's optimistic about this COP27 and maybe who's not. I mean, I think about 40, maybe 50% optimistic, so the rest, so it's 50-50.
50-50.
Do you think your recommendations have a better chance than 50-50 to get through?
I actually think that by COP28, yes. You need time. First, people need to look at it. We've been trying to sell it, and let's not overdo it. They need time to absorb these recommendations. We need to sell it. We need to explain it in words that policymakers can understand and not in jargon. So we are going to have to do all of that between now. I'm expecting that by COP28 to see some of this going on, not right away.
So the WTO also, of course, deals with disputes, unfair competition, which I imagine there are some fights. One of them is actually the US with the Inflation Reduction Act. Certain countries think that this is unfair competition, even if it helps advance the net zero goals. Where do you stand on this?
I can give you the right answer, which is I'm not allowed to comment on any possible dispute. But in spite of that, I'll take a risk. Look, we don't want, the WTO does not want to be at the receiving end of trade frictions. So some of our members feel that the Inflation Reduction Act is indeed, discriminating against their products, and they like similar products. Korea has complained about it, the EU, etc. What we're encouraging is dialogue between the two members. And this is actually happening. It doesn't always have to end up in a dispute at the WTO. And I think the US is also, Catherine Tai, the USTR, is doing very well at trying to get members to talk to the US, talk to each other. That's what we're encouraging, and we think something will come from it. That way we wouldn't need to deal with this friction at the WTO.
Talk to me about timelines of dispute. This is, I mean, they're long. Some of them lasted 12 years.
I think this is one of the, valid criticisms of the dispute settlement system, which is seen as the jewel in the crown of the WTO. It's the only place in the world where you can do this. And it's a good system, but over time, all systems have their issues. And I think that a criticism level by the US, which I think is valid, is that it's been taking too long. It's supposed to take 90 days to settle a dispute, but some have been taking years, as you said. So we need to bring it back. That's part of the reform of the WTO that we need to do.
When you look at, so today is Finance Day, so when you look at some of the financing that's going into private projects or investor deploying some of that capital, what's it looking like in the trade business? What role can finance play?
Well, some of the investments that will be needed to make trade work on the infrastructure side, for instance, you need financing to do it, and I hope the private sector will be investing. I think they are. I mean,
yes.
Private sector sees actually what is happening. There's a lot of talk of greenwashing, but there's also some very real investment and innovation going on with the private sector, and we applaud that. I mean, when shipping is looking at alternative green fuels, it's real. The issue is, what does it mean? It might be lighter ships not carrying the same amount of cargo, and so on and so forth. But innovation is happening, and investments are going in. We need more of it. Why do I say that? The urgency of the matter. If we don't all take this climate crisis we're in, let me use that word because I do feel it's a crisis when 1/3 of Pakistan goes underwater and you lose 80% of its crops. When, millions of hectares in Nigeria, my own country, go under and 600 people lose their lives. When you don't know which other, when the Yangtze and the Danube and, they all dry up and, it's very difficult. Paraguay, the river that carries its goods to the sea, is also affected by drought. The costs of trade are going up, and countries may lose their comparative advantage because of that. They may not be able to produce and sell the same things. I feel it's a crisis, so we need to step up investments and step up action.
You've also spent your life trying to fight poverty,
yes.
And there's a direct link between climate change and poverty.
Absolutely. I mean, the pandemic has set us back. The interesting thing, Francine, is that trade, the multilateral trading system, I know maybe not everyone agrees. I see it as a global public good. It has been built and nurtured over 75 years through the GATT and WTO. It has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty. Yes, it has left some people behind. There are poor people in rich countries and poor countries, but it's done a lot. And, so now the pandemic has set us back, the war is setting us back, but trade can still be an instrument to help us lift more people out of poverty.
Do you still see that resolve amongst members and heads of state? Because of the cost of living crisis, because of inflation, there are many economists saying, like, look, this is taking a step back, then maybe we can accelerate, but it seems we're taking a step back.
No, it's taken a knock from leaders. The resolve is not there as it used to be because of all the vulnerabilities that have been exposed. That's why we're reminding policymakers and leaders not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to remember what they created and the purpose it has served. This is the time to invest in and support the multilateral trading system, not to fragment it. So we need to build that will back. And when we talk to them and we talk about the pros and cons, we see some resonance.
Dr. Ngozi, I think it was back in 2015 that a group of WTO members nearly concluded an agreement called the Environmental Goods Agreement to reduce tariffs on goods, basically to help climate change. Do you think something like that could be revived?
Yes, that's exactly one of the things we are talking about. It was shelved in 2016 over a dispute in the number of goods and certain goods that may favor certain countries and so on and so forth. But we think it stands a chance. We would like to see it as one of the recommendations that we think trade can deliver. You'd be amazed to see that, some fossil fuel-based goods have a more favorable tariff regime in some countries than renewables, for instance. And so countries really need to look at what they're doing in their trade policy and change that. And part of it, if we could get an agreement on environmental goods and services with favorable tariff reductions, that would be a good thing.
But you think it's achievable? I mean, not all members, of course, are going to be behind it.
I think it's achievable if we have the will to do. I don't think it's achievable with a large number of products. A recommendation is to start the APEC group, for instance. They have an understanding. It's not an agreement with a limited number of goods. The UK with some other countries, 50-something goods. So let's start realistically small around a number people can agree, and we can build up from there.
I mean, we also had the US midterm elections, so we do need to mention them. Unclear exactly who will win at the moment. We didn't have that red wave that we were expecting.
Yeah.
But the Republicans are advancing. What does that mean for the US commitment to maybe some of the proposals that you're putting together?
It just means we have to work really hard with Congress. And we have to support the USTR and to deliver. They've been trying to work with us, and we appreciate that. But I've also been visiting Congress, both sides of the aisle, and I have a terrific team that is working with me, so we'll pound the pavement.
Dr. Ngozi, we have a lot of chief executives here. How should they be thinking about the transition when it comes to trade? Maybe their own trade. Like, what's your advice on how they should look at it going forward?
Well, I think they should really, I don't want to use the word pressure. I think business is not speaking up enough about how useful the multilateral trading system is to them. I don't hear their voice as much at the No, let me step back. John Denton of the ICC and the whole group, they have been talking to us and working with us, so that's not completely true. But I'd like to see business speak up more for the things it cares about. I don't see business putting as much pressure as I'd like to see on the dispute settlement system. Then come on climate change, I think they should be the ones also putting pressure for an environmental goods and services agreement. Surely they're interested in a rational global carbon pricing regime. Imagine if you're a business person, you go to these countries, the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment. You go to another one, they have a carbon tax of some type. You go to a third one, is a price of, we have these systems ranging from $1 a ton of CO2 emissions to 130 in Sweden. And, we just heard from Uruguay today, they are developing a system at $170 a ton. Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said at last COP, I was in a session with him, they're also looking at 170. We encourage all these moves. But as a business person, especially if you're an SME, how do you deal with all this? So business needs to be, so what I say, for what you need to make your business work and go through the transition, you should speak up on the trade side. Support the right policies that will make life easier for you.
Dr. Ngozi, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.